Hello, all. Today we're going to be talking about the basic foundations of democracy. This is not an exhaustive run through, but just kind of to get your feet wet. So, we begin with the idea democracy itself comes from the ancient Greek, the idea of the demos, meaning the people, and the idea of the demos kratia, the people rule. So, democracy is one of those forms of government. Did it start with the ancient Greeks? No, of course not. People have been regulating and ruling themselves throughout the entirety of human history at various points. But our understanding of it and the written understanding of it goes back to ancient Greece, and in particular, a couple of philosophers, these two guys here in the middle. On the left is Plato, and on the right is Aristotle, and that is at the Athenian Academy. Plato is our first real political philosopher. He writes The Republic, among others, where he outlines his vision of the ideal government. And his conception of the perfect government is government by what he calls the philosopher king. And he's going to call this form of government an aristocracy. The idea of the philosopher king is that in Plato's world, the absolute best person to make decisions for the state is going to be the wisest, the most selfless, the person trained to make these sorts of profound decisions from birth. And he also tells us that this person is going to have absolutely no interest in governing and is going to have to be forced into that role. But in his conception, the philosopher king, there's one perfect individual, totally selfless, always does the right thing, always makes the proper decision. And that is, in his ideal world, his republic, his utopia, what the ideal ruler might be. But he's also going to give us the acknowledgement that not every philosopher, not every philosopher king is going to have a long tenure, that the people are likely to resist, that the people might not even recognize the philosopher when they come along. So what he suggests is that kind of the most ideal real-world form that we might find is what he's going to call a democracy, the idea that we'll have rule by the honorable. And here he often means rule by like the military. So the generals that have proven themselves selfless, have spent their lives and careers in service of the state, he suggests might be kind of our best option. Again, you're going to have a few people that are doing or trying to do the right thing. But over time, what we recognize to be honorable might get corrupted a bit. We might think someone's honorable simply because they are prominent and wealthy, and he's worried that over time, rule by the honorable will give way to rule by the wealthy, rule by the elites within a society. He's going to call that oligarchy. And eventually the people will get fed up with rule by the wealthy, revolt and overthrow them, and ultimately give way to democracy or rule by the people. And then what Plato is really most worried about in the big scheme of things is that he didn't have much faith in the people. He didn't have much trust in the people. And he's really worried that the people will hit hard times, lose a war, have a drought, the economy will be struggling, and they'll be looking for someone to blame. They'll be looking for easy answers and an easy out. And at that point in time, what Plato is really concerned about is that democracy inevitably, he says, will give way to somebody offering those easy answers. The idea that some other group is the cause of your problems and only I will be able to fix it, so choose me to be the leader. And he's worried that democracy will inevitably give way to tyranny. And once you've reached tyranny, it may be possible that the honorable in society fight back against the tyrant, or the wealthy see their livelihood threatened by the tyrant, or the people finally get fed up with the tyrant and revolt. But for Plato, this is a cycle that will always arrive again at tyranny. He's an optimistic sort of fellow. Aristotle, on the other hand, wasn't necessarily worried about the cycle of governments. He's a categorizer. He just wants to be able to categorize and classify everything. So what he's going to tell us is that you can actually identify there's only 6 forms of government in the world, according to Aristotle. And you can start out by asking just 2 questions. You can ask how many people are in charge? How many people at the end of the day get to make decisions? Is it one person gets to make all the decisions? Is it a few people, or is it many people? And if you have just one person making all of the decisions for a society, are they a good person? Are they pure? Are they have pure motives, or are they selfish and corrupt? And once you have those two things answered, you have described every single government that's ever come along. So if you have one person in charge and they are pure, they always do the right thing, they are Plato's philosopher king, he's going to call that sort of government a monarchy. And if they are corrupt, one person in charge doing whatever is in their own selfish self-interest, he's going to call that individual the tyrant. If you have a few people in charge, maybe this is a triumvirate, if you're going back to Rome. If they are pure, he's going to call that aristocracy, so a small selected group of decision makers, versus if they are corrupt, he's going to call that oligarchy. And then if you have many people in charge, the people, here's your demos again. And you might be thinking, well, democracy is obviously good, but not for Aristotle. What Aristotle figured was people, again, not a lot of faith in humanity. People are inherently selfish. They're corrupt. They're self-serving. They'll stab you in the back if it will help them get ahead. And what he sees as democracy is when the many rule, but they are corrupt and selfish. And if they were all pure, if we all always did the right thing and thought about others, he would call that sort of system a polity. So Aristotle's idea of one, few, many is going to be very informative for us. The first thing that we ought to perhaps just cast aside is, based on everything we know about human interest and humanity, the idea of monarchy, aristocracy, polity, there's very few among us who are truly selfless. And the idea that we would ever put together a government that was 100% pure and benevolent and working for the greater good at all times is perhaps unrealistic. So in the real world, we operate as tyrannies, oligarchies, and eventually democracies. So let's take Aristotle's conception here. Rule by one, rule by few, rule by many. And obviously, rule by one is an endpoint, but many is one of those terms that is varied, right? How many is many versus how many is a few? Where exactly we draw that line is a real question mark. And you can make different cases. Also note that Aristotle's never going to give you rule by all. The idea that we would have everybody involved in decision-making is equally as unrealistic as the idea that we would have everybody acting from pure motives. So as we try to figure out the line between rule by the few and rule by the many, at what point do we switch from oligarchy to democracy? Where is that line? We can start to ask a few questions, right? And there's a case to be made that even the United States, we struggle with what side of that line that we fall on. We can ask questions like, who's allowed to vote? Who's allowed to participate in a system? We might have a system where only a few people get to participate, say only men, only people that are citizens or own property or fit a particular racial category. That might be exclusionary, right? If we're talking about white landowning male citizens, if we're talking about America in the early days, out of the entire society, that's a very select few number of people, as opposed to if you have government of the many, you might have universal suffrage. The majority of the people, men, women, regardless of racial or ethnic background, regardless of property ownership, have those privileges. We might still include a requirement of, say, citizenship. That's one of those requirements that perhaps makes more sense. Again, it's not rule by the all, but rule by the many. We might ask who they get to vote for. So you might have a system where white landowning males get to vote for other white landowning males. They might get to vote for representatives to go and represent them. It might be one representative for ever how many number of people. If you have one representative for 800,000 people, that might be fewer involved in government than one representative for every 10,000 people. You might also have a system where you have more direct participation, where everybody gets to vote on everything. And this was the classical Athenian version of democracy. Not many people got to participate, only citizens. But once those citizens were identified, they were all welcomed to the council meetings. They were all given an equal vote. The final thing we might ask would be something like who is allowed to lead? Who can be the leader? Who can be a representative? Who can be the president? Do you have to meet a whole bunch of requirements? These requirements might be good, they might be bad, but the more requirements you have, the more exclusionary it is, the more you lean towards the government of the few. Whereas if you have the opportunity for anybody can lead with equal likelihood, you might have government that's closer to the many. And there's certainly, a case to be made. For the ancient Athenians, the idea that you would have elected a government was anathema to democracy, because they would have argued that the wealthiest, the most well-spoken and eloquent, the most popular would be the person who would win. And that is not necessarily democratic. It's not even necessarily good government. Being popular does not make you a good leader. Instead, what the Athenians did was they drew lots. They basically drew straws. So it was random chance. If you drew the short straw, you got to be the leader of Athens for a period of time. Did they always get the best leader? No. Obviously, if it's a random draw, you might get the best person, you might get the worst person, and chances are you're going to get somebody in between. But the idea there was that anybody had an equal shot. It didn't matter about how much money you had or how beautifully you spoke. The talents were irrelevant. Everyone had an equal opportunity, and they said that was the most democratic system they could envision. Might not be the best, but it was more democratic.